All right, last piece of the day. No name, no face. Hell, not much of a woman either. She's selling for the price of a busted chair. All right, last piece of the day. No name, no face.
She was sold like an animal, but he treated her like a queen. Dakota, spring 1869. The wind screamed through Dakota Crossing, dragging a river of red dust from the plains and flinging it into every corner of the small frontier town. It wasn't a sandstorm, but a long, punishing gale, the tired, endless breath of a land that had seen too much blood and too little mercy. Dust clung to everything: hair, skin, clothes. It crawled into mouths and eyes, scraped against teeth, and left a bitter, metallic taste that no spit could wash away. A crowd had gathered around a rough wooden platform thrown together from warped planks. All men, coarse men, the kind whose hands had been shaped into claws by axes, hammers, and reins. Their shirts were stiff with old sweat, their trousers crusted with red earth, sawdust, and grease. The air reeked of tobacco and unwashed bodies, horse sweat and cheap whiskey, a smell that clung like a second skin. Their eyes were bloodshot and narrow, restless with the kind of hunger that had nothing to do with food. On the platform stood a woman, still, straight, unyielding. An old shawl of faded indigo clung to her head and shoulders, wrapping tightly around the right half of her face, as if it could keep the world out. Her dress was nothing more than rough, threadbare linen, the hem tattered and stained. Her feet were bare, dirt ground into the skin like a brand. Her wrists were loosely bound in front of her, the rope frayed and gray from too much use. She didn't tremble, she didn't bow her head, but her breathing came short and sharp, a thin thread of control stretched to breaking. Beneath the shawl, her eyes black, sharp, and unblinking scanned the crowd the way one might watch a pack of starving dogs. She saw the glee, the cruelty, the curiosity. She didn't see pity. The man with the gavel stood at the edge of the platform. His tin sheriff's badge was so tarnished it looked like a dead coin. He slammed the gavel down, the crack of wood on wood cutting through the wind. "All right, last piece of the day." His voice rasped, a smoker's growl that caught in his throat. "No name, no face. Hell, not much of a woman either. She's selling for the price of a busted chair." Lank. Laughter ripped through the crowd, hard and mean. "Take off the rag," one man shouted, spitting into the dust. "Let's see what's wrong with her. Bet she's hiding a face that could scare a horse dead." Another called, his voice thick with whiskey. A third man, grinning wide enough to show gaps in his teeth, shouted, "I heard she's already been used up by Injuns, by trappers, by God knows who. Ain't worth a plug nickel." The laughter swelled, a sound like boots grinding bone into dirt. It was the laughter of men who needed someone else to feel smaller than they were. Wabaha did not flinch. Her eyes stayed locked on the sea of faces, unblinking, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She stood there like a lone pine in a winter storm, battered, but rooted too deep to fall. The sheriff raised his voice over the jeers. "All right, boys, opening bid $2. That's less than a bottle of the piss you call whiskey. Who's man enough, or drunk enough, to take home a half-faced stray?" There was more laughter, sharper this time. Someone muttered loudly enough for all to hear, "If she's lucky, maybe she'll end up with a man who don't mind covering her face with a sack." Another voice answered, "Or under him in the dark, where it don't matter what she looks like." The wind caught the shawl, lifting one edge just enough for a flash of skin to show. She reached up quickly, pulling it back in place, her fingers steady but her jaw tight. And then, a shift. The noise thinned, like a fire choking for air. Heads turned. The crowd parted slowly, a ripple moving from the back toward the platform. From the open space stepped a man. His coat was heavy canvas, shoulders broad under the weight. The brim of a faded black hat shaded his face, hiding everything but the shape of a jaw set firm. His boots were coated in layers of dried mud. Sweat stains marked his shirt where the fabric clung to him. His pace was slow, deliberate, each step settling deep into the dust. He looked like a man who had spoken more to trees than to people, who had walked miles without saying a word. The kind of man who didn't flinch when the world turned ugly because he'd seen worse. His name was Silas Boone. Silence fell over the square. The wind still whistled, but the human noise had ceased. Silas's eyes, as deep as old stone crevices, swept past the crowd and settled on the auction block. He didn't look at the auctioneer, nor at the crowd, but directly at Wabaha. He didn't look at the scar or the shawl, but into her eyes. $3, Silas said, his voice low and steady, unhurried, impatient. It was a voice familiar with the solitude of deep forests. The auctioneer squinted, incredulous. "You sure about that, friend?" Silas's expression didn't change. "I said what I said." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. "Must be desperate." The auctioneer cleared his throat, looking confused. "Don't you want to see what you're buying?" Silas tilted his head slightly, still not taking his eyes off Wabaha. "I'm not buying a face," he said softly, just loud enough for the auctioneer to hear. "I'm marrying a person." The wind seemed to stop. No one laughed. Silas's voice wasn't angry, nor was it longing. It was simply an affirmation, an undeniable truth. The auctioneer muttered, scribbling on a crumpled piece of paper. Name, Silas Boone. Occupation, logger. He pushed the paper toward Silas, who signed it without a blink. Then he turned to Wabaha. "Ma'am, you're legally married now. Tell me your name for the record." The shawl on Wabaha's face moved slightly. At first, there was no sound. Then, very softly, a voice emerged, as soft as green moss, but as steady as hardwood. "Wabaha." Silas froze. He couldn't believe his ears. Her name, her voice, echoed in his mind. 3 years ago, in the cold and dark of the snow, a voice had saved his life. He had never heard her name until now. The silent forest, the blood-stained snow, the brilliant light in the ice cave, it all rushed back to him. He turned his back to the crowd and walked away, but not straight. He walked toward the wooden platform. He touched Wabaha's arm. Not roughly, not hastily, just firm enough to say, "You're safe now." When they left, no one in the crowd stopped them. No words followed, only the slow, deliberate thud of Silas's boots against the warped wooden planks and the faint rustle of the name that had just been spoken, still clinging to the air as if it feared disappearing. Behind him, Wabaha moved quietly, the soles of her bare feet no longer scraping against splinters. He had given her a pair of old boots, worn but whole. They were too big for her, the leather cracked and soft, but they covered the cold from the earth. The scarf still covered the lower half of her face, yet her back was straighter now, shoulders no longer caving in as though trying to hide her very existence. Around them, the pine forest closed in like a great, solemn audience. The road narrowed into a red dirt trail layered with dry pine needles, their brittle edges whispering underfoot. Faded light filtered down through a roof of tangled branches, the kind of light that seems to hesitate before touching the ground, as though even the sun was wary of drawing too close to these two figures, moving together through the wilderness. Wabaha said nothing. She walked behind Silas, leaving just enough space between them for the wind to pass through. Whenever a gust pushed hard enough to tug at her scarf, she would lift a hand in one smooth motion to fix it, making sure her face stayed hidden. Her movements were practiced, almost ritualistic, the reflex of someone who had lived too long in the gaze of those who judged without knowing. Silas kept several paces ahead, leading a mule heavy with supplies that clinked and shifted with each uneven step. He didn't look back, didn't force conversation. Every so often, his eyes drifted to the canopy above, scanning the branches as if listening for something beyond the wind, something old, something that had traveled this forest longer than either of them. The silence between them was not the brittle, awkward kind that begs to be broken. It was the quiet, built by two different kinds of survival. They had both endured in isolation, each cloaked in their own kind of secrecy. Now, in this strange crossing of paths, they walked side by side without needing the permission of words. It was the silence of two souls accustomed to distance, now finding that they could exist in the same space without fear. By the time the sky had given up the last traces of daylight, they reached a cabin. It stood alone, made of dark pine logs, not large but solid, every beam fitted with the care of someone who had built it to last. A stone chimney rose from one side, and next to the door sat a neat stack of split firewood. Above the doorframe, an old horseshoe, rusted but unbroken, had been nailed in place, a ward against the kind of bad luck you couldn't shoot your way out of. Silas stepped onto the porch, the boards sighing under his weight, and pushed the door open. The hinges protested with a long creak, releasing a breath of cool, still air from inside. He stepped aside, his voice low but firm. "You can stand wherever you want in here. No one's going to force you anymore." Wabaha entered cautiously, her posture still guarded but no longer bent. She did not remove the scarf. Her boots, his boots, now barely made a sound against the wooden floor. She didn't move toward the table or the hearth. Instead, she crossed to the farthest corner of the room, the one where the shadows pooled deepest, and sank into a low crouch, her back to the wall, her knees drawn close, hands resting lightly on them. She didn't look at him. Silas came in after her, setting the bundle of firewood near the stone hearth. He began building the fire without ceremony, without glancing in her direction. The only sounds were the clink of metal, the dry crack of kindling, and the soft whoosh as flames took hold. Gradually, the air in the cabin shifted. Warmth began to crawl outward from the hearth, carrying with it the deep, layered scent of life, being coaxed back into the bones of the room, cinnamon, smoked meat, and a faint saltiness that hinted at broth long simmered. He moved with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, not just the cooking, but the act of making a space livable, survivable. He didn't rush. Every gesture was measured, steady. The fire grew, light pushing back the shadows until the log walls glowed and flickered, their grain alive with movement. In her corner, Wabaha remained still. She was a small, dark silhouette against the far wall, the scarf breaking her outline into sharp planes of shadow and fabric. The firelight reached her in fragments, catching the edge of her cheekbone, sliding away. Her eyes followed the flame without moving her head. The light's dance on the walls made the cabin feel both safe and strange, as though they were sitting inside the memory of a place, not the place itself. Outside, the wind prowled through the pines, its voice long and low, a sound that felt older than both of them combined. Inside, Silas placed 2 wooden bowls on the table, one in front of where he sat, and another directly across. Then, after a moment's pause, he fetched a 3rd bowl identical to the others and set it on an empty chair beside him. He didn't look up when he spoke. "Before, I always made 2 bowls. Even if no one was there to eat the second one, it was how I reminded myself I'd made it home safe." Wabaha's head shifted slightly, just enough to let one eye catch the bowl's shape in the firelight. She looked from the empty place setting to him. "Now," Silas said quietly, "I make one for me, and one for you." The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound, but the thick, pulsing weight of something neither of them wanted to name. The fire popped softly, a log shifting in the grate. After a long while, Wabaha extended a hand toward the table. Her fingers curled around the bowl meant for her. The scarf stayed on, but her grip was firm despite the faint tremor in her hand. She kept her gaze on the bowl as she lifted the spoon, tucking it under the fabric to eat without revealing her face. Each bite was small, measured, but she finished the portion without leaving a trace. Silas said nothing, just cleared the bowls once she was done. She watched him the entire time, her head resting lightly against her knees. For the first time, she didn't flinch when he moved near. The firelight caught her eyes, steady now, their darkness no longer bottomless, but holding the faintest reflection of the flames. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying with it the smell of distant rain, though no drops would fall tonight. The forest would stand guard until morning, and the cabin would keep its warmth through the long hours. And in that small, flickering space between them, between the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of wooden bowls being set aside, something began to take root. Not trust, not yet, but the kind of fragile knowing that 2 people who have survived too much can sometimes share without speaking at all. Later that night, after the fire had died down, leaving only the warm embers, Silas sat alone in front of the hearth. He didn't light a lantern. The firelight was enough, casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls like silent memories. 3 years ago, it had been a harsh winter, the cold turning pine needles to glass and lungs to fire. He had gone too deep into the forest, greedy for wood and arrogant. He slipped, dislocated his leg, and fell into a snowdrift with no trail. He had stopped fighting, but then rough hands had pulled him away. He remembered the pain, the sound of his body hitting rocks, and then the darkness. He woke up next to a fire in a small cave hidden behind an ice curtain. The fire crackled, and the scent of moss and bitter bark filled his nostrils. Opposite him was a silhouette, a woman. Half her face was covered with a shawl, exactly like the one Wabaha was wearing. "You don't need to know who I am," she said, her voice neither high nor low, just soft, measured, and weary. "But I won't let you die." He remembered the taste of the medicine, bitter, but he drank it. She bandaged his leg, propped it up on hot stones, and kept the fire going all night. When he woke up, it was morning, and she was gone. Only the fire remained, and beside it, a piece of cloth embroidered with pale purple wildflowers. He kept it, still holding it in his coat pocket. And now in the cabin, a woman with a similar voice, with similar quiet hands, and with a name, Wabaha. He closed his eyes. He didn't need proof. He had felt it from the moment she spoke at the auction block. Not the name, but the sound. He didn't tell her that night. He let the memory live within him, a silent understanding between past and present. He glanced at her small silhouette leaning against the wall, the shawl still on her face, her back still turned. The same fear, the same need to disappear. But this time, Silas thought, she wasn't alone anymore. And that might be the beginning of something that could survive even the cold snow. The next morning, the forest held its breath with caution. The mist still clung to the tree trunks like secrets unwilling to be revealed. A gentle breeze passed through the pine needles, high and slow, as if it, too, did not want to disturb anyone. Wabaha stepped out of the cabin alone. She walked softly, her arms crossed over her chest, heading toward a tall pine that stood like a sentinel on the edge of the clearing. The old shawl still covered half her face, but her steps were no longer trembling. Her back was straighter, not from pride, but because it was no longer hunched. At the base of the tree, she sat down, tilting her face slightly toward the early sun, filtering through the branches. With slightly trembling hands, she untied the knot of the shawl at the back of her neck. The shawl slipped down enough for her to breathe with her whole face in the wind. Her mouth, her nose, a small part of her cheek. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was a beginning. Silas saw her from the corner of the yard, where he was kneeling beside a wooden basin, oiling a saw blade. He didn't stand up, didn't call to her, but after a moment he spoke, his voice low and even, as if speaking to the trees rather than to her. "I was badly hurt once, in the middle of winter, lost near Black Ridge. I should have died there." His fingers still worked the saw blade, cleaning it, but someone found me, pulled me into a cave, saved my life. Wabaha didn't turn around. She wore a shawl, didn't say her name, only revealed her hands. He paused for a moment, then turned his head to the side, just enough for his words to carry further. "Your voice, it's just like hers." After a moment of silence, there was a very soft sound, the rustle of cloth against skin. He didn't flinch, even when he felt her eyes on him. When he finally looked up, she was looking directly at him. The shawl was in her lap. Her face was not disfigured. It was a human face, but it bore an unmistakable mark. A long, curved scar ran from her right temple to just above her jawbone. The scar wasn't new or bleeding, but it was deep and permanent. She met his gaze, no longer hiding, but not defiant either, just raw. Her voice was as soft as a whisper. "The owner of the inn where I worked said I could keep the room if I gave him something else." She swallowed. I said no. He didn't like that. She looked down for a moment, then back at Silas. He broke in. I fought back, pushed him. He slipped. His head hit the stove. She looked straight into a distant memory. He died. I ran. Silas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. They said I killed him on purpose, that I had enticed him, that it was all planned. Her voice trembled. There were no witnesses. No one believed me. She looked at her hands. They called me a liar, a whore, a murderer. Silas stood up, wiping his hands on a cloth. Wabaha continued, her voice even and low. They sold me to pay off his debts, passing me from hand to hand like cattle. They told me to cover my face so people would forget, so I would become invisible. She looked at the shawl in her lap. I wore this so others wouldn't look at me as if I were something toxic, so they wouldn't see the scar and judge my worth before I even spoke. She looked up at him again, her eyes glistening but fierce. I didn't ask to be saved. I didn't ask to be bought, but I was so tired of running. Silas didn't move toward her. He didn't touch her. He just nodded. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me." His voice was even, warm, sincere. "You didn't have to, but you did." She blinked hard, but no tears fell, only a breath. And in that breath, something had changed. For the first time since she arrived, she was no longer a shadow. She was a woman with a name, a story, and a face. And Silas had seen all three, and hadn't turned away. The sunlight seeped into the cabin slowly the next morning, a cautious, golden light pouring through the narrow window above the table. Dust motes turned lazily in the beam like tiny spirits dancing, blessing the stillness. The air in the cabin was quiet, not with fear anymore, but with the hush of an understanding, like a breath held in the space after something fragile has been shared and carefully received. Wabaha had said almost nothing since yesterday, but she hadn't reached for the old shawl. She no longer pulled it up to cover her face before sleeping, no longer kept it at the foot of the bed like a shield waiting for a battle. Her hair, unbound and tousled from sleep, rested on her shoulders as she rose from the small bed. Her steps were still cautious, her posture still guarded, but something tiny about her presence had shifted. It was like the ground beginning to thaw beneath the snow. She squinted at the light flooding in through the window and walked toward the table, expecting the familiar things: a coffee tin, a wooden bowl she washed every night, an old spoon. But she stopped. Something new was waiting for her. A small mirror. It stood upright, silver-framed, old at the edges, but polished clean. It was angled just perfectly to catch the rising sun, to illuminate, not to expose. Beside it was a sea-blue silk scarf, faded but soft and neatly folded, as if it had once been a treasure. There was no note, no gesture pointing to it, just the mirror and the scarf placed there, as if they had always belonged on that table, and as if she had always been meant to find them. Wabaha stared at the objects for a long time. She didn't move. She approached the table slowly, as if afraid the mirror might reflect something she couldn't bear. But when she got close, she looked into it. The scar was still there. It would always be there. But so was the woman behind it. Her gaze lingered, then shifted to the scarf. She lifted it with both hands. It ran through her fingers like water, cool, gentle, kind. She placed the scarf against her head, not to hide the scar, but to frame what others would see, to soften the lines, to control her own image, not out of shame, but out of choice. The scarf fell into place as if it belonged there. In the mirror, a new image emerged. Not the hunted girl from the auction, not the ghost from the blizzard, but a woman, whole, upright, still carrying what she had been through, but no longer buried by it. Behind her, there was a sound, the gentle tread of boots on the wooden floor. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Silas stood in the doorway, one shoulder leaning against the frame. He had entered without a word. That was his way. But his expression was not one of caution or surprise. It was one of quiet reverence. He tilted his chin toward the scarf. "That was my wife's," he said, his voice even. "She wore it whenever she needed to feel like herself again." Wabaha's fingers touched the silk near her temple. "I thought maybe it would suit you, too," he added. She turned slightly toward him, no longer avoiding or guarded. He held her gaze, unblinking. Then, with a voice as soft as moss and as firm as an anchor, he said, "Anyone who tries to shame you for what you've survived is blind." A moment passed, and the blind have no right to judge beauty. Her throat tightened. Tears fell slowly, but they fell. Not sharp, desperate tears, but warm, cleansing ones. She looked at herself again. Then gently, she reached out and placed her palm flat against the mirror, touching her own reflection. And for the first time in a very long time, Wabaha allowed herself to be seen. The peace they found in the woods did not go unchallenged. It never did in places like this. Trouble arrived on horseback, alone, under a bruised purple sky. The man was thin, long-legged, his duster coat ragged with dust and miles. His eyes were gray, sharp, and cruel, cutting through the crowd in the saloon like a knife through raw hide. He called himself Cutter, and Cutter was no drifter. He was a bounty hunter, the kind of man who could read tracks like scripture and smell secrets under boot leather. Rumors had drifted up the southern trail of a scarred girl hiding in the hills, her face once covered, now revealed. Someone whispered she had blood on her hands and a logger for a shield. Cutter listened, and then he rode. When he reached the logging camp near North Ridge, he asked too many questions. He played the part of a lost traveler, claiming he was looking for work with the loggers, saying he'd heard about a man named Boone living deep in the woods. Silas came across him near the supply shed. It took only one look for him to know, not by the words. Cutter was polite, calm, but the way his eyes swept the tree line, the stillness in his posture, it was the stillness of a snake just before it strikes. That evening, Silas returned to the cabin. His face was colder than the wind. "He's hunting you," he said simply. Wabaha said nothing at first. She stood by the stove, stirring a soup that had grown thin with memory. Her eyes were steady but distant. Then, without a word, she crossed the room, opened the wooden trunk at the foot of the bed, and took out the old shawl, neatly folded, exactly as it had been since the morning she took it off. Wabaha held the shawl in her hands for a long moment. "I'll wear it again," she said softly. "One more time." Silas looked at her. "You don't have to." Her eyes met his. "This time, I'm choosing it. Not out of shame, but out of strategy." That night, they planned together. Wabaha would ride east along the old burned trail. She would wear the scarf, and Cutter would follow. He wouldn't be able to resist following a lonely, scarred, and veiled girl, a ghost reborn. Silas would go over the mountain pass, ride across, and meet the sheriff in town. If the plan worked, Cutter would ride straight into a trap. And it did. At dawn, when the sky was just a pale pink, Wabaha rode out on Silas's second horse, the scarf tied tightly on her head, her heart pounding. This time, she didn't tremble. She looked straight ahead. By dusk, Cutter had taken the bait. He followed her deep into the eastern rock falls, where Silas was waiting with the sheriff and 2 men from the mountain patrol. Cutter drew his gun first, but not fast enough. He was disarmed, tied, and thrown onto his own horse, charged with illegal pursuit, attempted assault, and murder. Wabaha had watched it all from a high ridge, her figure still hidden by the shawl. Only when Cutter was long gone did she ride down. When she reached Silas, he stepped forward to help her dismount. She let him. Then, slowly, she reached up and untied the knot of the shawl covering half her face. The shawl slid down. She folded it once, then twice, and held it in her hands, staring at the cloth. Silas watched her, unsure what she would do. She looked up at him, her expression calm, but no longer afraid. "It saved me again," she said, "not because it hid me, but because I used it." He nodded. "So what will you do with it now?" She looked at the trees, at the fading trail, at the world she had once passed through like a shadow. She folded the scarf one more time and tucked it under her arm. "I'll keep it," she said softly. "Not as a cage, but as proof." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Proof of what?" She smiled. "That even what once was my prison can become my shield, if I choose it to be." And for the first time, there was light in her voice. Not the light of laughter, but the light of a woman who has survived the darkness and can now name it. It was mid-afternoon when there was a knock at the door. A slow, uncertain knock. Not a demanding knock, but a knock of permission. Silas opened the cabin door to find a woman on the porch. Her dress was worn, stained from the road, and her boots carried the red dust of long trails. Her skin was dark, her posture straight, her eyes cautious but kind. She held her hat in both hands. "My name is Mavis," she said. "Mavis Green. I used to work at Ridley House. Kitchen help, mostly cooking. Behind Silas, Wabaha stepped into the doorway. She stopped dead when she saw the woman. Mavis took a step back, then stopped. "I heard you were here," she said softly, "and I thought it was time I stopped being a coward." The wind sighed softly through the pines as the silence stretched between them. "I saw what happened that night," Mavis said. "Saw him drag you into the back room. Heard you screaming, heard the crash, but I didn't speak up. I needed the job. I needed to eat." Wabaha's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "I'm not proud of it," Mavis continued, "but I can make it right now if you'll let me." Later, at the table, beside cups of tea, Mavis recounted everything, the details that only someone who was actually there would know. She described the bruises, the blood, and the subsequent silence. "I should have said it then," she whispered. "But I'll say it now. You told the truth. With Silas's help, they wrote it all down." Mavis signed the affidavit with a strong, careful hand. The letter was sealed and sent to the nearest justice office by a mounted courier. Weeks passed. The forest grew greener. The sky grew warmer. Then one morning, the sheriff rode up with a single envelope in his hand. Silas opened it on the porch, reading it twice before going inside. Wabaha took it with both hands. The words were few. Charges against Wabaha Crow dropped, case closed, arrest warrant recalled. She read them over and over. Wabaha stepped outside, past the woodpile, past the horses, and down to the tree line. She found the old pine, where she had first removed the shawl. She sat down at the base of the tree, ran her fingers through the moss, and breathed. She didn't cry. She didn't laugh. She just closed her eyes, and with a voice smaller than a breath, she said, "For the first time in my life, I don't have to run." Justice had come, not with trumpets, not with applause, but with the truth, and the quiet strength of one person who had finally decided to stand by it. Spring came to the hills gently. The trees that were once bare and brittle now wore soft buds, like promises waiting to bloom. The mist still rolled in at dawn, but it was thinner, lighter, as if even the mist had grown tired of hiding. Birds sang again. The river ran with purpose. The forest felt like it was forgiving. Silas was busy. With spare logs and a quiet attention, he built a modest wedding arch just outside the cabin, near the edge, where the wildflowers were starting to grow. It wasn't a fancy arch, 4 upright wooden posts, a simple arch covered with linen, but it stood firm, just like him. They invited only a few people. Mavis came, smiling brightly in a dress that didn't quite fit but suited her spirit. The old blacksmith from town brought a bottle of hard cider. The grocer's wife brought a basket of bread and a bunch of mountain lavender. They weren't many, but they were enough. Inside the cabin, Wabaha stood before the small mirror Silas had left for her months ago. Her dress was simple, hand-sewn muslin, a creamy color, but it fit perfectly because she had made it herself with steady hands and quiet late nights. On her head, she wore a wedding veil. It was the sea-blue silk scarf Silas had given her, the one that had been a symbol of his initial acceptance. Now, she didn't use it to cover her face, but to adorn her hair, to veil what had once been her shame, her fear, her name. When she stepped out of the cabin, the forest fell silent. Silas stood under the wooden arch, his arms crossed over his chest, his heart full. He had trimmed his beard, polished his boots, and ironed his one good shirt without a single sap stain. But none of that mattered when he saw her. She moved slowly, as if the ground had finally given her permission to be seen. And she was beautiful, not because the scarf hid the scar, but because she had chosen to wear it in her own way. When she drew near, Silas took her hand. His voice was low and warm, but every word was firm. "It doesn't matter what's hiding your face," he said. "You were always the woman I chose from the start." He paused, looking into her eyes. "And now, you're the woman I swear to stand beside until the end." Wabaha smiled, not with the caution of someone who has been hurt, but with the peace of someone who has finally been healed. She whispered, "And I swear the same to you." There was no priest, no vows read from a book, just them and the trees and the people who mattered most. And as they kissed, soft and sure, The wind picked up just enough to make the scarf flutter gently. A few drops of rain fell, light as a breath. That evening, as the fire crackled and laughter mingled with the birdsong, Wabaha sat next to Silas on the porch. The sea-blue silk scarf was neatly folded in her lap. She ran her fingers lightly over the embroidery. Mavis sat nearby on a large log, next to the old blacksmith. She whispered, "I never thought a scarf could be so beautiful." The blacksmith took a sip of his hard cider, his eyes on Wabaha and Silas. "It's not the scarf," he said, his voice husky and weathered, "but what she made it into." Wabaha heard their words. She looked at Silas, and he just gave a slight nod, a small smile playing in his eyes. She looked down at the scarf in her lap. It was still the same scarf, but now it was no longer a disguise. It was a possession of her own, a part of her story. Everything that had once been her prison had now become her shield. Her choice had transformed everything. In the flickering light of the campfire, she saw Mavis, no longer the scared woman from the past, but a woman who had found her courage. She saw the old blacksmith, who had seen the truth behind the rumors. She saw Silas, who had seen her even when she tried to hide herself. This wasn't a glorious victory, but it was a healing. Little by little, the invisible wounds had begun to close. They sat there until the last guests had gone and the stars began to appear. The forest, which had once been Wabaha's prison, now embraced them like a home. The night sky stretched overhead, a dark blanket embroidered with 1,000 twinkling lights. Wabaha leaned her head against Silas's shoulder, her hand resting on his. "It's funny," she said, her voice soft. "This thing used to carry all my fears." He looked down at her, his eyes gentle. "And now?" She smiled. "Now it carries all my choices." Silas nodded, intertwining his fingers with hers. They sat like that until the stars shone brightly, and the forest, which had once been their prison, now embraced them like a home. Under the tall pines, Wabaha and Silas had found what so many had lost in this wild land: peace. They had found it, not by forgetting the past, but by accepting it. Their love didn't erase the pain, the scars, or the silence, but it had turned what once bound them into something that could bless them. Because sometimes in the Wild West, survival isn't just about clinging to life, it's about choosing what to cling to.